It's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Losos, who is the Monique and Philip Lehner Professor for the Study of Latin America in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology here at Harvard. He's also the Curator in Herpetology for Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, which forms the basis for our exhibit upstairs and many other of our exhibits at the Harvard Museum of Natural History. As head of the Losos lab at Harvard, his research specialty is the behavioral and evolutionary ecology of lizards, with a focus on how lizards interact with their environments and how they have diversified evolutionarily. And the lab primarily studies the evolution of Caribbean Anoles lizards. Before joining the Harvard faculty in 2006, Jonathan spent more than a decade at Washington University serving as a member of the faculty, the chair of their environmental studies program, and director of the Tyson Research Center, helping lead efforts to provide a living landscape for environmental research and education at that university. He has received numerous honors and awards, including nomination as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Daniel Giraud Elliott Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, which honors meritorious work in zoology or paleontology, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship awarded to those who have demonstrated an exceptional capacity for scholarship and creativity in the arts and sciences, and the E.O. Wilson Naturalist Award from the American Society of Naturalists. All of this in addition to a staggering number of high-level grants from organizations like the National Science Foundation. He is the author of the book Lizards in an Evolutionary Tree, Ecology and Adaptive Radiation of Anoles, published by the University of California Press in 2009. And he has also edited and co-authored other seminal works, including the Princeton Guide to Evolution and the Princeton Guide to Ecology. And his work has been featured widely in the popular sphere in journals like Natural History, Scientific American, and the New York Times. A lot of accomplishments. My favorite is the shirt that he's wearing this evening, and also the wonderful music that he DJ'd for us at the beginning. But please let me all welcome Jonathan Losos.
Well, it's a great honor to be talking to you tonight to celebrate the opening of this exhibition. I just went through it this afternoon for the first time, and it is simply spectacular. The museum staff have done a wonderful job, and you're really going to enjoy the exhibit that they've put together. This is particularly a joyful occasion for me because I spent my entire life studying islands and how species have evolved on islands. And so to have an exhibit like this and to get to talk about it is really a lot of fun. As Jane said, there's so much to talk about or to put on a display about island evolution. It's very hard to decide what to put in and what to put out. And I've probably packed in too much into this talk, but I want to give you a feel for the diversity that occurs on islands and how that has informed our understanding of evolution. And one message I want to make sure you take away from this talk is that I study islands, and many of my colleagues study islands, not because we're interested in in evolution in islands per se. We are, but really we study islands because they are a particularly good place to understand the evolutionary process in general. And so by going to islands, we can learn a lot about how evolution works. And of course, Charles Darwin was the first person who really took advantage of that, and a long line of distinguished biologists have done so ever since. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about what is so special about islands. Why do we evolutionary biologists love to work there? Well, there are a number of reasons. First is that many islands are created as blank slates. They're volcanic islands that emerge out of the sea. Not all islands, but many of them are the result of volcanic activity underwater. The volcano starts erupting, it puts out lava, it builds up. Eventually the lava gets big enough that it emerges out of the sea. And that's how many new islands are formed. Now, of course, such islands initially have nothing on them. They're just molten lava that cools down into rock. But over time, first some plants arrive there, and then some animals, and an ecosystem builds up. And what's so special about these islands is that each one is an independent theater of evolution. And you can study that island, and you know everything there is a result of what happened right there. The species got there, and then they evolved. And so we can really see the evolutionary process in very stark detail on these islands. Moreover, This is aided by the fact that many types of plants and animals are not good colonizers, and they do not get to islands. And this has two consequences. First, the number of species on islands, particularly isolated islands, is often relatively small. There aren't that many species there. And that makes it relatively easy to understand how evolution has worked. I mean, imagine working somewhere like the Amazon rainforest, where there are all these species. It's really hard to figure out how one species affects another, what the important factors are. But on islands with relatively few species, it's much easier to isolate what is going on there. Moreover, because islands don't have that many species, that gives a lot of room for the species that are there to adapt to new circumstances. And so evolution is really magnified on islands. It occurs in much greater, it's much exaggerated. It's much easier to see what's going on. And for that reason, islands are particularly good places to study evolution. Now, in addition, many islands are young, not all of them, but many are young, and that means that the evolution that occurred there occurred relatively recently. We're not trying to figure out what happened tens of millions of years ago. It's something that happened geologically in a much more recent past, and thus it makes it easier to decipher. Islands also have defined boundaries. We don't need to worry that what we're studying, that the key factor happens somewhere else that we're not looking at. We know what the area is that we need to study. Now, this is a good place to point out that my talk today is going to focus about oceanic islands, islands in the ocean. But the same phenomena that go on these islands pertain to other areas that are surrounded by inhospitable media. For example, lakes in continents serve as islands for the animals that live in those lakes because it's very difficult for them to get from one lake to another. And so for fish and other aquatic animals, lakes are essentially islands. Alpine mountaintops also can serve as mountains, and many people study the island mountains, they refer to them. Even the human body can be thought of as an island for the microbes that call us home, and that's something that the exhibit will explore in future days. And so what I'm talking about really has broad applicability. Finally, perhaps not most importantly, but very importantly, there are lots of islands, and that allows us to study what's going on in many different places. For this reason, islands have been referred to sometimes as nature's test tubes of evolution. Just like a laboratory scientist doesn't do his experiment in a single test tube, but in many test tubes to be able to tell what is general from what is a unique happening in one place, we can look at many different islands to get what's generally important and goes on as opposed to what happens in a single place. Finally, islands serve as alternative evolutionary worlds. They let us see the different ways that evolution can occur, the many different outcomes that evolution can produce. By looking at islands across the range of different islands that occur, we can get an idea of what evolution is capable of doing. So these are the reasons that we evolutionary biologists like to study islands, and we've learned a lot from them. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to focus on three questions. The first question is, who gets to islands? Who are the actual players that get there? Second, what happens once they get there? And finally, third, is evolution on islands predictable? So let's start with the first question. Who gets to islands? Well, there are a number of ways to colonize an island. The first is by air. Species that can fly have it a lot easier to get to islands. And for that reason, it's not surprising that birds are usually the most abundant type of vertebrate on islands in terms of number of species. They just fly out there. There are other ways of getting there by air as well as active flight. For example, those of you who remember Charlotte's Web, you remember what spiders do. Baby spiders shoot out a little bit of silk that gets caught in the wind. It picks them up, and they can travel great distances in this way. They're sometimes referred to as aerial plankton. And in fact, spiders are one of the best colonists of islands. They can travel sometimes hundreds, even thousands of miles. Plants do the same thing, at least some plants. They send their seeds through the air. And these seeds can travel great distances and colonize islands. So one route to getting to islands is by air. Another route is by sea. Obviously, animals that can swim have a big advantage in colonizing islands. Animals, of course, like sea lions and other pinnipeds. And in fact, sea lions are usually one of the two types of mammals that you always find on islands, the other ones being, of course, bats. Bats and sea lions are very good at getting to islands. There are other species, however, that you wouldn't expect would be good swimmers, but actually are. For example, does anyone recognize this? Yes. What is it? It's an elephant's trunk. At least it was surprising to me that elephants are really good swimmers. And they actually can swim great distances. And as a result, elephants are quite good at colonizing islands. They've been known to swim as much as 20 miles across open water. So elephants are good swimmers. Another animal that to me was surprising in their ability to cross water are giant tortoises. Now they don't swim, but they have a life jacket on their backs. Basically their shell is full of air and they float. And the reason that we see giant tortoises on many islands is that they're able to cross large distances of ocean. Now this was actually demonstrated very clearly about a decade ago when a tortoise washed ashore on the coast of Tanzania. This was a tortoise from the island of Aldabra, right here in the Indian Ocean. It's an Aldabra giant tortoise, and it showed up here in Tanzania, a distance of more than 300 miles. Now, if you look carefully, you can see there are these white things on the tortoise's leg and shell. Those are barnacles. Barnacle specialists say that for those barnacles to get that big, the tortoise had to be in the water for at least 6 weeks. And it just floated across, and when it showed up, it was a little dehydrated, but it wasn't in that bad health. And so tortoises are able to float and to get to islands, and that's why you find them, or you used to find them, on many islands. So getting there by air or by sea are two good ways of getting to islands. But of course, there are many species that neither fly or swim very well, and they can't float. And how are they going to get to islands? Well, there is a third method by which species colonize islands, and that's by doing what we call rafting. And it's just what it sounds like. It turns out that the ocean often has mats of vegetation just floating in it. And animals can get on these mats of vegetation. They probably don't do it intentionally, but they drift along and get to an island. Now, these mats of vegetation occur for many reasons. For example, this is a photograph in the Amazon River where such vegetation mats are quite common. If you go to the Amazon, you'll see something like this. And they form in a couple of ways. One way is just vegetation falls into the river for whatever reason, and it just tends to glom together to form a pile of vegetation. Sometimes, however, the riverbank collapses. It gets undercut by erosion, and it just all falls into the water, and sometimes with the trees still standing up, and it just goes floating down the river, and it goes out into the Caribbean Sea and goes floating along. Well, sometimes there are animals on these mats of vegetation. That's a bird. It could fly there. You can see down here. But here's a raft, a small raft in India. For some reason, these two little deer were on the raft. They were probably in the water, and they climbed there for safety. Now, this is not a good way to get around. Most rafts sink eventually, or the animals die of exposure or starvation. But every once in a while, a raft will actually wash ashore sometime. It's a very improbable event, but given millions of years, it does happen. And that's how many animals have been able to colonize islands. For example, South American monkeys almost surely rafted to South America from Africa. It's very clear that the monkeys in South America are African in origin, and there's really no other explanation to how they got there. Rafting, it makes a lot of sense. It's really the only explanation in many cases, but of course it's very hard to observe, and some people are skeptical that it occurs for that reason. However, there was a great example of rafting that was documented a few years ago involving this animal, the green iguana. Now, you may be familiar with iguanas because they are very common in Central America and South America, but they also occur in the Caribbean. And they're very common, particularly on some of these islands in the middle of the Lesser Antilles. The islands to the north often don't have green iguanas, and this island here, Anguilla, one of the British, it's a British-controlled island, does not have green iguanas, or at least it didn't used to have green iguanas. But one day, a bunch of Anguillans were on the beach, and they looked out and they saw a mat of vegetation washing ashore. This wasn't it, but something like this. Now, this isn't that unusual event. These things would be out there, and occasionally they would wash ashore. What was unusual about this mat is that it had 15 green iguanas on it. As they watched, the vegetation washed up under the beach, and the iguanas just stepped right down and made themselves at home. And in fact, they've started breeding, and they've bred prolifically, and now green iguanas, I'm told, are all over Anguilla. Very clearly an example of a species rafting to colonize a new island. Now, you might ask, where did these iguanas come from? That can often be very difficult to determine. Normally what we might do is we might take some genetic samples from the green iguanas and then go around the Caribbean and take samples from natural populations to look for a genetic match. In this case, however, that was not necessary, because in the mat of vegetation, which was a bunch of leaves and branches and some fallen over trees, as well as the vegetation, there were some street signs. and the street signs were in French. And so that basically got it down to either Guadeloupe or Martinique. It turns out that 3 weeks earlier, 2 hurricanes had passed over Guadeloupe in the direction of Anguilla, and it turns out these green iguanas, that's where they were from. They were from Guadeloupe. So a clear example of colonization over more than 100 miles. All right, so that's how species can colonize isolated islands. But another question, we talked about who's good at colonizing. Who is bad at colonizing? What are the species that have difficulty getting to islands? Well, of course, species, oops, I got ahead of myself. Species that don't fly or swim very well are going to have troubles for starters because they have to raft, and rafting is not easy. Among those, amphibians have particular trouble because, as you know, amphibians generally have moist skin, and as a result, they dehydrate very quickly. And so they're not very good at rafting, and in fact, many islands have no amphibians whatsoever. Species with high metabolic rates don't do very well rafting because basically they burn up all their stores very quickly and they starve to death. And by species with high metabolic rates, I mean mammals. Warm-blooded animals like us just don't last very long on a raft. And many islands also don't have any mammals. Big species often don't do very well, in part because they don't fit on rafts. It's hard for them to raft along. They also have high metabolic rates often, and so they don't often do very well. For the same reason, carnivores are not very good rafters, and by carnivores I mean mammalian carnivores, and they are often absent from many islands. Forest species aren't very good because forest species are often adapted to the cool, moist forest interior, and the hot, arid sun on a raft just doesn't suit them well, and they can't survive. Species that have very specific diets often land on an island, and what they eat isn't there. So species that are very specialized in what they eat are not good colonizers. And finally, in the botanical realm, species with big seeds don't colonize very well because big seeds usually don't disperse very far. And what I'm particularly referring to here is trees. Most trees are lousy dispersers. They can't get their seeds very far, and so the seeds don't make it out to islands. And for that reason, most of the trees that you're familiar with on the mainland, you won't see them on isolated islands, with one exception. And that exception you are all familiar with. Everyone knows a coconut, but you may not have ever bothered to think, well, what is a coconut all about? Well, a coconut is a seed of a palm tree. It's a seed that's very well adapted to floating in water and germinating somewhere else. And so you'll find palm trees on islands all around the world because their seeds are well adapted to dispersing through the ocean. Now, let me just give you an example of one island. Well, the result of all of these problems is that many islands don't have a lot of species compared to the mainland, the nearest mainland, because so many types of organisms can't get there. Let me give you one example of this, the island of Cocos Island. It's in the Pacific Ocean. It's owned by Costa Rica. It's about 300 miles southwest of Costa Rica. And on Cocos Island, here is the fauna. There are no amphibians. There are no terrestrial mammals. There are only 2 species of lizards. Now, this is extraordinary because Costa Rica has one of the richest lizard faunas in the world. Hundreds of species of lizards occur in Costa Rica, but only 2 of them have made it to Cocos Island. Birds, there are 90 species of birds, but again, Costa Rica has hundreds and hundreds of species of birds, and most of them have not made it to Cocos. In fact, many of these 90 species are seabirds. Now, I'm an evolutionary biologist, so of course, I'm not supposed to call them birds, I'm supposed to call them dinosaurs. But that does remind me that Cocos Island has been in the news lately. Maybe you've heard about it. There's Cocos Island. We're building a new theme park. It's about to open. What could possibly go wrong? Now, the reason I mention this is, of course, in Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, the island is Isla Nublar, but Isla Nublar is Cocos Island. Isla Nublar is supposed to be a Costa Rican island. Isla Nublar means cloud island, Cocos Island is the only island in the Eastern Pacific that has a cloud forest. It's clearly Cocos Island is what Isla Nublar is based on. So I thought if nothing else from this talk, you'll have this interesting little nugget that you can tell people. The movie opens in less than 2 months. Incidentally, the people of Costa Rica, when Jurassic Park came out, there were people who were outraged because Cocos Island is a national park, and the thought that Costa Rica would allow a biotech company to turn a national park into a theme park, some people were furious at it. Anyway, a little information about Cocos Island. Well, what is the significance of all of these species being absent from islands? One part of the significance is the species that get there have a lot of opportunities available to them. The resources that are used by the species in the mainland, well, those that didn't get there, those resources are available. So, for example, if hummingbirds don't make it to the island, then the nectar is available for some other species to take advantage of. And so there are lots of unused resources because of the depauperate fauna of these islands. And so that gets us to our next question. What happens to these species once they colonize the islands? Well, I want to digress for a moment to tell you a brief story about a talk I heard a few years ago. It was by a historian of science. His name is Peter Bowler. He's an expert on Darwin. And he gave a talk asking the question, what if? The sort of question we ask all the time. But his question had to do with Charles Darwin. Now, as you all know, Darwin he circumnavigated the globe on the HMS Beagle, and there he made many observations that led him to come up with his idea of evolution. And so Bowler asked a simple question, what if the Beagle had sunk? What if Charles Darwin had gone down with the ship and had not lived? Well, of course, that would mean that his book, The Origin of Species, would not have been written. And the question that Bowler wanted to ask was, how would our understanding of evolution have progressed in the absence of Charles Darwin? Now, as you all know, Darwin was only one of 2 people who proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection. It was proposed simultaneously by Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was the great explorer and scientist who did his research, among other places, on the islands of the East Indies, in Malaysia and Indonesia. And he came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection as well. And so Bowler went on about, well, would Wallace have been able to carry the day? Or if not, when would the idea have been developed? And so on and so forth. And it was an interesting idea. I'm not going to tell you what his conclusions were. I'd be happy to talk about that later. But it really got me thinking, this idea of what if events had occurred differently? And so I want to propose my own scenario, my own what if concerning Darwin. It won't be so dramatic as him dying on the Beagle, but suppose the Beagle's voyage had been a little bit different. How might our understanding of evolution have changed? Before exploring this scenario, though, I want to review what it was that Darwin saw on the Beagle that so impressed him, that so got him thinking about evolution, particularly in the Galapagos. And there were two things in particular that Darwin saw. First was the phenomenon of geographic variation, of species that differ from one place to the next. And so Darwin was very impressed when he was informed by the vice governor of the Galapagos, a Mr. Lawson, who said that he, Mr. Lawson, if you gave him a tortoiseshell, he could tell you what island it was from. In other words, that there was variation from one island to the next, and it was so profound that you could identify the island just from looking at the shell. And this got Darwin thinking, well, why should this be? If islands were specially created by the Creator, why should they vary from one island to the next? And then he observed the same thing for himself when he started looking at the mockingbirds, which he called mocking thrushes. And he said, to my astonishment, I discovered that all of those from Charles Island belonged to one species, all from Albemarle Island to a second, and all from James and Chatham Island to yet a third. And so this really got him thinking, maybe species aren't immutable as it was believed. Maybe they could change. And that certainly planted the seed of the idea of evolution. The second thing that Darwin saw had to do with these birds, these finches that occur in the Galapagos and now bear his name. We now refer to them as Darwin's finches. Well, Darwin collected a bunch of these birds when he was on this trip, but to be honest, he didn't pay much attention to them. He didn't think they were very significant because he thought they were members of a number of different families of birds that he was familiar with from his time in Europe. He thought that the big-beaked bird was a grosbeak, the little one he thought was a warbler, and these two he thought were finches. And he thought this was nothing special, just the local representative of families that are found throughout the world. Well, when the Beagle got back to England and Darwin went ashore, he turned his specimens over to specialists in different areas. And so he turned his bird specimens over to John Gould, probably the most famous, the most noted ornithologist of the time. Gould studied the specimens and came back to Darwin several weeks later and pointed out that Darwin was wrong, that these birds were not members of different families that occur in Europe. Rather, they were all members of a single family, a family of birds hitherto unknown to science that only occurred in the Galapagos, which he gave the name Geospizidae. So these were all members of a family of birds only from the Galapagos. Well, Darwin immediately realized the significance of this, and as he wrote in his best-selling travelogue, Voyage of the Beagle in 1839, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species has been taken and modified for different ends. I mean, there you have it right there. This is evolution. In 1839, Darwin was very clear. He understood evolution, and he understood the mechanism of natural selection. Now, it took 20 years for him to actually publish his book, but it's very clear that his observations on the Galapagos and elsewhere helped him develop these ideas. Well, the question I want to ask, the what-if question, has to do with the instructions that were given to the captain of the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy. Fitzroy was given these orders. You are required and directed to put to sea and to proceed with all convenient expedition successively to Madeira or Tenerife, the Cape de Verde Islands, Fernando Noronha. In other words, going down the west coast of Europe and Africa, then across to the South American station to perform the operations and execute the surveys. Well, the question I would like to ask is, suppose that they had not been sent on their expedition, but they had been sent elsewhere. Specifically, suppose the instructions had been to go to Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. In other words, not circumnavigating the globe, but to the Caribbean islands. What would Darwin have seen there? Well, and what would he have thought of it? Well, I'll tell you what he would have seen there, because this is where I've spent my entire career doing my research. He would have seen lizards, particularly the lizards that I study, and I hope you'll humor me by letting me talk about my lizards for a little bit. Lizards in the genus Anoles, an incredibly abundant lizards that are all over the place and incredibly species rich. 150 or more species occur on Caribbean islands. Well, Darwin was a great naturalist, a great observer. He would have noted these lizards, he would have studied their differences, and I think he would have come to very much the same conclusions that he did by going to the Galapagos. Now, I should point out, for starters, Darwin, it's not that Darwin was aware of lizards. He certainly saw some fantastic lizards in the Galapagos. For example, the marine iguana, one of the most amazing lizards around today. This is the only ocean-going lizard in the whole world. It goes swimming in the ocean. It eats seaweed, algae. It goes underwater, dives down to the bottom, and munches on seaweed underwater. Then it comes up and it blows. You've probably seen the picture of them blowing salt out of their nostrils because they get all the salt, the seawater, and they get rid of the salt by blowing out of their nostrils. Just an extraordinary animal. And undoubtedly, we would think that Darwin would be very impressed by the marine iguana. Well, here's what he had to say. It is a hideous-looking creature of a dirty black color, stupid and sluggish in its movements. All right, so Darwin wasn't so impressed with the marine iguana. But the marine iguana has a cousin, and this is a beautiful animal, the land iguana. Golden yellow in color, it plods around 5 feet long, it eats cactus. Darwin surely was impressed by this species. Well, maybe not so much. They are ugly animals. From their low facial angle, they have a singularly stupid appearance. All right, so he wasn't impressed by the iguanas of the Galapagos. Nonetheless, I would contend that he would have been impressed by lizards like this, Allison's anole, a beautiful animal from Cuba. Well, what would Darwin have seen? He could not have missed seeing this because these lizards are so abundant. What he would have found was that on each island, the species of anolis lizards are very diverse. They live in different habitats, and they have different anatomical features that are adaptations to the part of the habitat they occupy. And strikingly, if you go from one island to the next, you see the same set of habitat specialists on each island. And so I want to briefly show you what these lizards are like. The first species we call the trunk ground species. It lives on tree trunks, and it runs down to the ground where it fights with its fellows, and it catches prey and so on. These are lizards that have long hind limbs that let them run fast and jump far. They're very muscular. They have very small little toe pads, and they're brown in color. These are the trunk ground species of several islands, and this structure is called a dewlap or a throat fan. The males stick them out to communicate with each other. Then there's the trunk crown species. These are species found on the trunk up high into the tree. They get out into the vegetation, And to do that, they particularly have large toe pads that let them stick on to smooth surfaces. We actually have one of these up in the exhibit upstairs, and this afternoon it was sticking to the glass with its toe pads. And you should go take a look at them there. They're also green in color. Here are the trunk crown species of several islands. Next are the crown giants. These are also high up in the tree, but these are the largest anoles. They're maybe about this big, and so they're on big vegetation. They're large lizards, a big head, a vertebral crest. They can also turn color from green to brown. These are also the most aggressive of the anoles. They will stand and defend themselves. In fact, I've found this out the hard way. It's very dangerous work working with these lizards. Don't try this at home. Here are the crown giants. Next are the grass bush lizards. These are the smaller ones that live in the low-lying vegetation. They're on ferns or even on grass blades. They're slender. They have short forelimbs, a long head, an extremely long tail, as much as 4 times the length of their body. Here are some of the grass bush anoles. And finally, the most unique are the twig anoles. These are the species that use the very narrow twigs, and they move very slowly. So they have very short limbs to keep them from toppling off these narrow twigs. They have a long head. They're also very light in color, camouflaged, because they can't run away. Their legs are too short. They're not very fast, so they have to rely on not being seen. And here are the twig anoles of the different islands. Well, Darwin wouldn't have known this, but it turns out one interesting fact about these lizards is that these similar types on different islands are not closely related. They have independently evolved to be very similar. So these 4 twig anoles on the different islands have independently evolved to be twig anoles. We can see this when we look at an evolutionary tree, what we call a phylogeny. This shows the evolutionary relationships. Each one of these little tips is a species. This is for the trunk crown anoles and the different colors on the different islands. And you can see the trunk crown anoles on the different islands are not closely related. They would be all in one clump if they were. And so they have independently evolved to be trunk crown anoles. And this is true of all the other types as well. And so even though each island has 6 different types of habitat specialists, the same 6 types, they have evolved independently on each of the islands. Well, what would Darwin have made of all of this? He certainly would have noticed it. These are very common lizards, very easy to find. If you've ever been to the Caribbean, you undoubtedly have seen them. Well, he was impressed at the variation of mockingbirds, that there was one species on one island, a different species on another. He would have been equally impressed by, say, the twig anoles, that there was one species of twig anole on one island, another species on another island, the same sort of variation. And just as Darwin was impressed with the Darwin's finches, he would have been impressed by the different adaptations of the different lizards, how they had all been derived from one ancestral species. So I would contend that if Darwin had gone to the Caribbean instead of the Galapagos, he would have had the same thoughts. He would have had the same ideas leading to his thoughts about evolution. But why stop at the Caribbean? Let's continue a little further. Suppose instead of going to the Galapagos at the end of his trip, he'd gone up to Hawaii, the most isolated island group in the world. What would he have seen in Hawaii? He would have seen these incredible birds called honey creepers, all the descendants of a single species of finch with this amazing diversity of beaks. They have these very long curved beaks for sipping nectar, big beaks for crushing seeds or eating fruits, little beaks for picking out insects, a huge variety of different beaks for species living and using different food sources. Well, if Darwin was impressed by this variation in the Darwin's finches, which is quite large, imagine what he would have said about this. It would have blown his mind. I think if he'd been to Hawaii, he would have published The Origin of Species right away. Now, in Hawaii, Darwin would have seen other things as well, such as the silver swords, these plants, again, all descended from one ancestral type that are as varied as a bush like this, an agave-like plant like this that has these big inflorescences, and some trees, all of these descendants of one species. Or finally, let's try one other what if. What if at the end of the trip, when they sailed across the Indian Ocean, if instead of sailing just by Madagascar, they had actually stopped and visited Madagascar? What would Darwin have seen there? Well, we actually have some idea because recently some other explorers visited Madagascar, and we can look at what they saw. I refer, of course, to these guys. And here's what they saw.
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. Yeah, I like to move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. Yeah, I like to move it.
Lemurs. They would have seen an incredible diversity of lemurs. And I have to say that DreamWorks did a pretty good job, at least I think so, of portraying the diversity of lemurs on Madagascar. You've got your eye, your mouse lemur, your black shafaka, rough lemur, and so on. They did make one mistake, however, and that is King Julian, the ring-tailed lemur. The mistake is that the ring-tailed lemur is one of those few species of primates in which the female is the dominant animal. And so King Julian should have been Queen Julia. This was actually pointed out to Jeff Katzenberg, the director or producer or whatever, before the movie came out, and he didn't want to hear about it. Well, here's maybe a little bit more accurate view of the diversity of lemurs around today, but it turns out that this is just a shadow of the total diversity of lemurs, because in fact, other lemur species evolved that are no longer present. Now, Darwin, you may not realize, not only was he a great biologist, but he was also a pretty good paleontologist. And when he was in South America, he made a number of important fossil discoveries. And I think in Madagascar, he would have done the same thing and found evidence of some of these extinct lemurs that were sadly wiped out by the first people who got to Madagascar in the last millennium or two. For example, there was this animal, Paleo Pittacus, an animal that hung upside down like a tree sloth. It had long arms with curved arms and digits to hang in a suspensory mode. Except tree sloths are, a few pounds. This animal was 75 pounds in weight. Or Megalodapus, an animal whose proportions were very similar to a koala. And we're not quite sure exactly how it lived, but it probably hugged trees like koalas did, except that this animal was 100 pounds. But the biggest lemur was a terrestrial species, Archaeoindris. This animal was the size of a gorilla. So all of these animals were part of the lemur diversity. As I said, they went extinct. They were wiped out by humans in the last few centuries. There are other things that Darwin would have seen, as well as the diversity of lemurs. These birds called vangas, which have a diversity of bill shapes comparable to honey creepers in Hawaii. However, if Darwin had taken these specimens to John Gould, Gould would not have been able to set him straight, because even until very recently, ornithologists thought that these birds were members of different families. It was only when scientists sequenced their DNA that we realized that it's all one family of birds, the descendants of a single ancestral species that got to Madagascar and proliferated. In fact, there are all kinds of groups in Madagascar. I haven't talked about the chameleons or the tenrecs, and you're going to have to go to the exhibit upstairs to see something about them as well. So my bottom line point here is that it really almost didn't matter where Darwin went. Almost any major island has had this phenomenon of a species diversifying wildly, just like the Darwin's finches did. It's a phenomenon that we have a name for it. It's called adaptive radiation, and it refers to the diversification that occurs when an ancestral species reaches a place and then diversifies to occupy many different ecological niches. Well, it turns out that adaptive radiation is a phenomenon most clearly seen on islands. In fact, if you have a textbook and you look up adaptive radiation, you'll probably see one of the examples I've given you or some other one from islands. It's something that happens very clearly and most often on islands. Now, why is that? Well, I've already told you the reason. It's because of the ecological opportunity, because so many species don't get to islands that there are resources available that wouldn't be available on the mainland. A finch on the mainland can't start sipping nectar because there are already species that are specialized to do that. But you take it out to an island where there's no hummingbird or anything else, those resources are there and they can start adapting to that resource. And so the opportunity that is afforded by the lack of colonization ability of so many species is what prompts adaptive radiation. Well, adaptive radiation is a predictable result of what happens on islands, but in general, how predictable is evolution on islands? This is my last question. It turns out there are two schools of thought about this. On the one hand, there are some people who argue that evolution is very predictable. For example, George McGee, a theoretical biologist at Rutgers University, suggests that if we find life on another planet, that life there will look strangely familiar, that the outcome will be very similar to evolution on Earth. This idea has been taken even further by Simon Conway Morris at the other Cambridge, the University of Cambridge in England. He argues that the demands placed on organisms by the environment are very strong. That, in other words, the aerodynamics of how to fly or how to crush a nut or how to dig, and that there are optimal solutions to these problems. And so natural selection will lead species to evolve the same sort of adaptations time and time again. And so he argues the constraints of life make the emergence of the various biological properties very probable, if not inevitable. He goes so far as to say, making the emergence of something like ourselves a near inevitability. So what McGee and Conway Morris are arguing is that evolution doesn't have a lot of different solutions. That you face a species with a particular problem, it will evolve in a predictable way. This view, however, is not unanimous, and probably the biggest opponent of this view was our very own Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, one of the greatest evolutionary biologists of the last century. And Gould took the exact opposite tack. He argued that evolution was not at all predictable, that it was very haphazard and contingent, that the events that occur in history could send evolution in one way or another. One extreme example had to do with the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period. Imagine that that asteroid hadn't actually hit Earth, but had just missed, if its path had been a little bit different. Well, if it had missed Earth, the dinosaurs would still be here, and where would we be? We'd still be in little bushes acting like an opossum. Well, that's an extreme example, but Gould argued that even little events could send evolution in different directions. Any replay of the history of life, in other words, if we started again, but you altered it by a little bit, an insignificant jot or tittle at the outset, would have yielded an outcome of entirely different form. So Gould's argument is that evolution was very idiosyncratic, that events could send it in different directions. Well, the problem with this debate is it's really impossible to get evidence one way or the other. We can't get 10 Galapagos Islands and seed them with a finch and see if the same outcome occurs time and time again. We can't hit some planets with an asteroid and not others. Maybe someday we will find life on other planets and we can test that idea, but until then, it's a very difficult idea. But this is where the idea of islands as test tubes come in. We can look at what has occurred on different islands and see how similar the outcome is from one island to the next. If evolution is indeed predictable, as Simon Conway Morris and McGee argue, then we would expect very similar outcomes on different islands. On the other hand, if it is idiosyncratic, as Gould suggests, then we expect to see a lot of things evolve on only one island with no parallels elsewhere. Well, what do the data suggest? There are some examples of repeated occurrences. The Anoles lizards that I talked about are probably one of the best examples, where the same set of habitat specialists have evolved independently on 4 different islands, a very predictable, deterministic outcome. There aren't very many other examples like that, though. There are some snails on islands near Japan where 3 types of habitat specialists have evolved multiple times. But those are really almost the only 2 really good examples. Then there are less stringent examples. In Australia, if we want to consider Australia an island, people like to line up the Australian marsupials and point out that they have parallels elsewhere in the world. But this isn't saying that 2 places have evolved the same faunas. They've just shown that Australia has a lot of matches in many different places. So it's not like the 2 have had the exact same evolutionary outcome. And moreover, although there are a lot of matches for Australian animals, there are a lot of things that there are no matches. There's no kangaroo or koala anywhere else in the world. So really, the evidence for repeatability on different islands, at least in my view, is not very strong. What about the opposite? Gould's argument that evolution is idiosyncratic. I would suggest that there are lots of examples of evolution doing different things, or doing what I call a one-off, a species that evolved on one island and there's nothing like it anywhere else. And let's start off with the greatest animal of all time, the duck-billed platypus. Here's an animal that paddles around in creeks in Australia, eating crayfish and other things. Nothing like it has evolved anywhere else in the world. If evolution was repeatable, we ought to have platypuses, at least in the southeastern United States. I want my platypus, but it's not here. It's a one-off only in Australia. Here are a few other examples. The giant earwig of St. Helena, an enormous bug. If you remember the Star Trek movie where they put the bug in Chekhov's ear, that's what this was, I think. The Selenodon of Hispaniola, an animal that goes snuffling around in the leaf litter trying to find insects. Looks like something out of Dr. Seuss. Nothing like it anywhere else in the world. The tree lobster of Lord Howe Island, actually a big walking stick. It's now limited to this crazy island called Ball's Pyramid. A caterpillar in Hawaii. Now, we all think of caterpillars as these lovable, peaceful creatures. We learn about them in grade school. They go along munching leaves and so on. Well, think again.
This is a carnivorous caterpillar.
The carnivorous caterpillars of Hawaii. Or my last example from Cuba, a 3-foot tall owl, 3 feet tall, and it doesn't fly. So you could go on and on this list of idiosyncratic things that have evolved on one island, no parallel anywhere else in the world. Well, we could test this idea of repeatability in another way. We can look at species that use the same resources, the same ecological niche, if you will, and ask if they've evolved to use that niche in the same way. And I want to give you, and so if evolution is repeatable, you'd expect them to evolve the same adaptation. Simon Conway Morris would say they'll evolve the best way of doing it. Gould would say they'll find different ways on different islands. Let's talk about a bird we all know, woodpeckers. Now, if you ever really thought, here's how a woodpecker finds its prey. It's got this really stout beak, and it pecks around on a tree trying to find a hollow space by the echo. When it finds a hollow space, it goes pound, 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 20 times a second, hitting it with its beak, which is reinforced, and its brain has reinforcing to keep it from getting a concussion. And people are studying how they do that. And then it has this really long, so it digs a hole to get at the grub or the larvae. And then once it gets the hole, it sticks its long tongue in to snare the grub. And their tongue actually wraps around the brain, and that's how they have room for such a long tongue. And so that's how they get their prey. Well, it turns out that woodpeckers don't colonize very well. You don't see them on most isolated islands. For some reason, they just don't do very well at that. And so on many islands, other species have moved into that niche of eating larvae like grubs and larvae and so on. On Hawaii, it's a species called the Achiopala, something like that. And if you look at their beak, they're not the same as woodpeckers. And in fact, their beaks have, their upper bill and their lower bill are very different. Their lower bill is very stout, somewhat like a woodpecker's, and they don't bang it away, but they chisel a hole in the wood. And then once they have the hole, they use their curved upper beak to reach in and snag a prey. And so that's how they get larvae. Now, in New Zealand, there's a bird, sadly extinct, called the huia, in which those two bill functions have been split into the different sexes. The male has the stout bill where it digs a hole by chiseling away at the wood. The female has a curved beak that reaches into holes to extract the prey. Now, it used to be thought that they worked as a team, that the male did the hole and the female reached in. It was a great story, but it turns out we don't know if that's true or not. Unfortunately, we don't know much about them because they're extinct, and we just don't know. Maybe they did that. Maybe they had just different ways of getting prey in inaccessible areas. So those are two alternatives to woodpeckers to digging a hole and getting the prey. There's a third species that does this, one of the Darwin's finches, the woodpecker finch. It has a rather unexceptional beak, but it's found a different way to extract prey from holes. It uses a tool. Here it's fashioning its implement.
Yes, just right.
And that's how it makes its living. Pretty remarkable. But even remarkable is the last example I'm going to show you, the last woodpecker type animal, but it's not a bird at all. It's a type of lemur in Madagascar called the eye. And the eye has a remarkable way of extracting grubs from holes.
To find its prey, it uses a multi-purpose digit. The changes in sound build a mental map of hollow channels inside. It cups its ears to gather the slightest vibration that could signify something to eat, like a grub. Sharp incisors rip away the bark. Its bony middle finger changes roles from a scanner to a scraper. The eye locks in. The finger transforms into a hook. A sharp fingernail impales the grub. It's dragged up, out, and into the eye's mouth.
Yummy. Well, I think this is strong evidence for Gould's argument. Very different ways of solving the same problem. Evolution is not at all predictable. It goes about it in different ways. But I want to take this point one step further and think about entire alternative worlds. And in particular, let's get back to that asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. What if it had wiped out the mammals as well? What would have happened? How would life have evolved in the absence not only of dinosaurs but mammals? Well, there's no way of answering that question. Or maybe there is, because there's one place in the world where there are no terrestrial mammals at all, one very interesting place. I refer to New Zealand, these islands 1,000 miles off the coast of Australia. And for whatever reason, there are no mammals in Australia. Let's take a look at what has evolved there. Let's start with the remarkable bird, the kiwi. Some people refer to it as an honorary mammal. Look right here, for example, it's got whiskers, right, just like a cat, right on its forehead. Let's look at some other ways that the kiwi is like a mammal.
Is an evolutionary oddity. For a start, it's an honorary mammal.
Told you so.
Unlike any other bird, his nostrils are situated at the end of his beak, allowing him to detect prey up to 6 inches underground. And his weird plumage is more like shaggy dog fur than feathers. The youngster is intruding on another kiwi's territory.
That's where they get their name.
And knowing he's been
Kiwi,
detected,
kiwi.
he takes off. The chase reveals all kiwis' most startling evolutionary feature. Instead of flying, they run.
So the kiwi is sort of mammal-like, but most of the other denizens of New Zealand are not particularly like mammals. For example, the major herbivores of New Zealand were not anything like deer or antelopes. They were these large relatives of the kiwi, the moas, the largest of which got to be almost 10 feet tall. And these were the herbivores. There were 11 different species of them. Unfortunately, they are all extinct now, hunted out by the early New Zealanders. In addition to the moas, the world's largest bird of prey, Haast eagle, preyed on some of these moas. Then there was the kakapo. There is the kakapo, a flightless parrot. I mean, think about this, a parrot that doesn't fly. It just walks around on the ground eating fruits and food like that. And there are not many predators in New Zealand, and so another parrot has become carnivorous. This is a bird, the kea, that is reputed to attack sheep, not to kill them, but to peck at their backs and eat little chunks of them. They also have become adept at destroying windshield wipers. There's the huia I talked about, the woodpecker replacement. And so there are all these birds that have evolved in very interesting ways. But it's not just the birds that have done interesting things. For example, there are giant flightless crickets called wettas, shown here, a younger version of myself. There's a hamburger-sized giant land snail. And then there are these bizarre plants they have a trait, they're called divaricating. And what they've done is that they have the branches on the outside and the leaves on the inside. It's backwards. Presumably, a number of different plants have evolved this in New Zealand, presumably an adaptation, a defense against moa herbivory. So there are all these different unusual adaptations of New Zealand animals, but perhaps the most unusual one has to do with one of the few mammals that is there, one of the bats, the New Zealand short-tailed bat. Now, the famous biologist Jared Diamond referred to this bat as the bat's family attempt to make a mouse. As we'll see, however, he probably picked the wrong mammal to compare it to.
They can fly, all right, but our infrared camera reveals that they also have a very un-bat-like way of hunting. They land on the ground and forage through the leaf litter just like shrews. They're walking on their wrists, with the bones of their fingers pointing upwards and slotted into a groove along the upper arm. Now they seem to be hunting as a pack. Insects or other small creatures in the leaf litter, fleeing from the jaws of one, run straight into those of another. Worms are a great favourite, so much more satisfying than several hundred mosquitoes, and they don't want to share them with one another either. They complete their meal with a drink of nectar from the Hades plant that bloom flat on the ground. They're this plant's pollinators. Relationships between a plant and its pollinator.
So what New Zealand shows is that a world without mammals, or without many mammals, would be very different from the one that we're used to everywhere else. I think very clear evidence of the lack of predictability of evolution. To me, islands very clearly show that island evolution is idiosyncratic. Now, does that mean that there is no predictability to island evolution? No, there are some consistent generalities that do characterize what happens on islands. And I'm going to end my talk with just a couple more minutes telling you about what some of these generalities are. Probably the most famous one has the very uninformative name of the island rule, and it has to do with size evolution of mammals on islands. And what happens is that big animals tend to get smaller, big mammals on islands, and little ones, up to say the size of a fox, get bigger. Now, the most famous example of this is much more dramatic, the ones that get smaller. And the most famous example has to do with elephants on islands. This is a species of elephant that used to be found in the Mediterranean. It was around in the Pleistocene relatively recently. Now, take a close look here. This is my friend Louise Roth, a professor at Duke University, and she's kneeling. And even though she's kneeling, she's still taller than this male elephant. And take a look, this is a baby elephant. These were tiny little elephants. And these tiny elephants evolved on a number of different islands. In addition to dwarf elephants, there were also, oxymoronically, dwarf mammoths that evolved on a number of different places. For example, one of these places, Wrangel Island here in Siberia, these dwarf mammoths were around until about 4,000 years ago. So think about that. While the pyramids were being built, there were dwarf mammoths still in Siberia. So these puny pachyderms, as I call them, occurred on islands in many different places around the world. Now, some of you may be aware that there's been a lot of discussion lately about maybe we could somehow recreate a mammoth. There are all these frozen carcasses in the permafrost in Siberia, and perhaps we could recreate the mammoth. My colleague Beth Shapiro has just written a book. It's just out, How to Clone a Mammoth. And it's really a brilliant book. I highly recommend it. But I think Beth didn't quite get it right. We don't want to really recreate a mammoth. We want to recreate a dwarf mammoth. Think about how great that would be. What a fabulous, what a great companion. But these dwarf mammoths would be more than just pets. They could also be service animals. And this was actually realized years ago in the town of Bedrock. Now, for what it's worth, while I was preparing this talk, I came across this picture. This is a dwarf elephant on the island of Sri Lanka that was recently reported. If you look at this elephant, it's an adult male, but its proportions are a little bit funny. And in fact, here's the same elephant right next to a normal-sized elephant. And so I'm not saying that dwarf elephants are evolving in Sri Lanka, but you can see how this process might get started. A mutant animal, if somehow favored, could begin the process of size reduction. Island dwarfism has occurred in many animals on islands. There are very small hippos that evolved in Mediterranean islands and elsewhere. There were small deer on Jersey Island. The fossil record shows them reducing by 80% over a period of a few thousand years. On the island of Flores, there was not only a dwarf elephant, only 3 or 4 feet tall, but recent fossil evidence you probably heard about the famous hobbit, a hominid species this tall, Homo floresiensis, that was around until 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, there was another species of hominid existing in the world, and it was this dwarf species occurring on an island in Indonesia. We actually have a cast of the skeleton up in the exhibit, and take a look at this really remarkable person, another species of hominid, a dwarf one from islands. So why this dwarfing occurs is much debated. It may have to do with a lack of resources, a combination of lack of resources and lack of predators. Many animals are big in part to defend themselves, to make themselves invulnerable to predators. In the absence of predators, they don't need to be big, and also their populations get very large because they're not contained by predators, and they eat up the resources, and so smaller animals need less food. Those may have been the selective pressures that favor dwarfism. Now, as I said, this rule applies only to mammals. It's not clear that it applies to other types of animals. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it's certainly the case that other types of animals, there are examples of big things getting even bigger. So for example, in birds, the largest bird ever to live, the elephant bird in Madagascar, this was a bird 10 feet tall that weighed half a ton. The largest egg of anything ever known, we have a cast of one upstairs, occurred in Madagascar as much as recently as 500 years ago. Of course, the Komodo dragon, the largest lizard in the world today, on the small Indonesian island of Komodo. So that's one predictable pattern, size evolution on island. I want to quickly run through a couple of others. Many animals lose their ability to fly on islands. Many birds have become flightless, such as the kiwi, the dodo of Mauritius. Many insects, many types of beetles and moths and other animals become flightless on islands. Why they do that, it's not clear. It may be, again, due to lack of predators, so they don't need to fly around, so why bother investing the energy in producing wings? Many island animals become tame, again, probably because there aren't many predators. The animals in the Galapagos are famous for their lack of fear of people, and this is true of many other island animals. Of course, this was the downfall of the dodo. When they were discovered on the island of Mauritius, sailors would just come up and club them over the head, and alas, they clubbed them into extinction. The last example I'm going to talk about are trees. I mentioned earlier that trees don't get out to islands very well because their seeds don't disperse across seawater. Well, what happens is plants do get out to islands, and then there are no trees shading them, and so it's an advantage to any sort of little shrub or weed to get a little bit taller, to get taller than your neighbors and get all the sun. And so there are species of plants that on the mainland are always little bushes and shrubs, but on islands they turn into trees. For example, in St. Helena, the cabbage tree is a type of plant that normally produces cabbages or those sorts of little plants, but on St. Helena it's become a tree. In the Galapagos, there are forests of Scalesia plants, a relative of the sunflower. But in the Galapagos, they've evolved into a number of different species of trees. Also on the Galapagos, cactus have become trees. And so again, it's an example of ecological opportunity. The lack of trees, other species take over and turn into trees. It's a very common phenomenon. Well, finally, I want to make one last prediction about the predictability of evolution. And my prediction is that you are going to love the exhibit upstairs. There's all kinds of great stuff. And so I've talked long enough already. I'm going to end my talk by thanking you for your attention. I'll take a few questions, and then we should all go upstairs and look at this great exhibit. So thank you very much.